Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, today back in Missouri, this frigid cold snap is really making life miserable for everyone. We have below zero temperatures and wind chills and a lot of snow. In fact, a lot of children are home from school today. And you know, it's on snowy days like this back in Missouri and across much of America that we really appreciate the ability to go to our thermostats and to turn up the temperature and to be able to sit by a nice fire to keep warm. And what we don't need is the government interfering in that. You know, safe, affordable, reliable energy is vital for all of us as Americans, and it is being threatened by the Environmental Protection Agency. They are increasing burdens and making our regulations more difficult and costly for hardworking taxpayers. While I support common sense regulations designed to protect my constituents and the environment, many of the EPA regulations have gone too far, threatening to raise electricity rates during these cold winter months and hurting markets designed to provide rural homes with proper heating systems. County officials, farmers, city administrators, as well as moms and dads all across Missouri who have to pay the electric bill every month are constantly coming up to me with stories of the burdens that the EPA regulations have placed on their families, their businesses, and their communities. It's time for this to stop. It's time for the EPA to begin working with my constituents, with local officials, and with state governments to bring common sense, consensus-driven changes to their regulations instead of the typical heavy-handed Washington bureaucracy. Many of these regulations are stifling small businesses and local communities, leading to slow economic growth, stagnant jobs, and less opportunities for the next generations of Americans. So today, my colleagues and I would like to outline some of the most egregious EPA regulations and offer common sense solutions to fix, replace, or eliminate previous EPA actions that are hurting the average American. For example, the EPA's recently proposed rule on source performance standards for new power plants has raised serious concerns among ratepayers, utilities, and small businesses in my district. My main concern with these proposed regulations remains focused on Missouri's need to provide affordable and reliable electricity. However, in a state like Missouri that derives over 80% of our power from coal, the EPA has proposed a rule that would create a de facto ban on building any new coal-fired power plants by requiring the use of something called carbon capture and storage technology. This technology has not even been commercially proven viable anywhere, and the small private pilot projects used as the basis of the EPA's analysis have been highly subsidized by the government and are not commercially viable. Congressional intent in the Clean Air Act is clear. The EPA is required to complete a cost-benefit analysis and base their regulations on the best commercially available technology. It is clear that these standards have not been met. The good news is that there's a bipartisan solution for this regulation. Congressman Whitfield and Senator Manchin have introduced the Electricity Security and Affordability Act. They designed the bill to require that any greenhouse gas standards set by the EPA for new coal-fired plants are achievable by commercial power plants operating in the real world, including highly efficient plants that utilize the most modern, state-of-the-art standards that can be met by all states in a way that is not economically damaging to local ratepayers and small businesses. All we ask is that the EPA work with us to find common sense solutions for real-world problems. Another example of needless regulation is the EPA proposed rule on future production of wood-burning stoves like the one in this picture right here. My constituents are concerned that this regulation could provide another de facto ban of the production and sale of 80% of America's current wood-burning stoves, which is the world's oldest heating system. The EPA's stringent one-size-fits-all policy goes against the will of the people And it requires the same stringent standards in a cottage in the woods that it applies to high-rise building in downtown New York. For the first 10 years of my marriage, my husband and I heated our home with a wood-burning stove like this. And I'm concerned for the many constituents who have used these stoves for years to heat their home, that they'll have to turn in their old furnaces for scrap and make costly upgrades if they choose to remodel. So again, I implore the EPA to apply a little common sense to these onerous regulations and not finalize this burdensome rule. These are just two examples of the many concerns of the EPA overreach that I hear on a regular basis. And I pause now to invite my colleagues to share experiences and issues that their constituents face dealing with this agency. So I'd like to start with my dear friend from Colorado, Doug Lamborn. Representative Lamborn, what would you like to share?
Well, I thank my friend and colleague, the gentlelady from Missouri, for her leadership on this issue, for putting this time together. This is an important topic. Mr. Speaker, I hear from Coloradans every day who are struggling just to make ends meet. Unemployment remains high, and Americans are striving to provide necessities for their families. Prices at the pump have doubled since President Obama took office. According to the Energy Information Administration, they are on a trajectory to rise even higher. Sadly, as American families and small businesses continue to suffer from these high energy prices, the Obama administration's response has been to impose job-killing and expensive rules through the Environmental Protection Agency. These expenses are passed on to American consumers. These policies, such as attempting to regulate greenhouse gas emissions through the Clean Air Act, only end up hurting consumers. As the chairman of the Natural Resources Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources and a proponent for business-focused regulations, I have been vocal against many of these harmful regulations. The EPA's continued power grab ends up taking legislative authority out of the hands of those who are sent here in Washington to represent the American people and puts it in the hands of unelected bureaucrats carrying out the agenda and policies of the White House. I have co-sponsored numerous bills to repeal many of these regulations piece by piece to ensure Americans that they would have affordable energy. Coloradans and the rest of the country should not have to choose between heating their homes and feeding their families. I remain committed to seeing what I can do to stop this bureaucratic overreach. Just for one example, and my friend and colleague alluded to this, the EPA wants to force American coal-fired power plants to use carbon capture and storage technology that does not even exist. Since it doesn't exist, this is an impossible mandate to obey. The EPA is basing its regulations on wishful thinking, not sound science. They need to be brought under control. The ability of working Americans to pay their bills hangs in the balance. I yield back, and I thank the gentlelady for putting this important time together.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for your leadership on this. You've been at the forefront of this, and this is so, so important. And I love what you said about that the EPA is basing this on wishful thinking and not sound science. I think most of us would appreciate if there was some science behind regulations. That seems to be common sense, but they clearly have gone beyond that, and it's hurting, as you say, people. It's hurting the bottom line. It's hurting when you pay your bills every month and your electric bill is just going through the roof unnecessarily because of these onerous regulations. So thank you, gentlemen. And now I'd like to turn to my friend and colleague from Utah, Representative Chris Stewart, to share his thoughts on this important topic. Thank you, Chris.
I'd like to thank my friend from Missouri for allowing me to speak tonight, and thank you for organizing this. I think this is an important issue. In fact, I would say that this is a critical issue. It's a great example of why the American people don't trust the federal government. Let me say that again. The American people don't trust the federal government. So much of what they do doesn't make any sense. And so much of what the EPA does doesn't make any sense. I was the chair of the subcommittee on the environment. We had direct oversight over EPA. again and again I saw examples of the things that they did that illustrated that they were an agency that are in many ways out of control. At one point, they had proposed regulations over ozone that were virtually impossible for many Western states to comply with. Western states like my home state of Utah, their regulations would have been so restrictive that there was more naturally occurring ozone than they would have allowed. It doesn't make any sense. There are multiple studies that were sponsored by the EPA concerning supposed contamination of groundwater from fracking that were so sloppy and so obviously biased that even the EPA had to finally admit them and to withdraw their own studies. Once again, it doesn't make any sense. Why would the EPA try to stop fracking, a technology that has led to cheaper energy, more efficient energy, jobs, economic growth in many parts of our country? It doesn't make any sense. There is the war on coal that I suppose many will be speaking about tonight. That, as my friend Ms. Hartzler was saying, it drives up the cost of energy for every working family and does nothing to reduce global carbon emissions. But I'd like to take a minute and spend with a little more detail about what I think is one of the most egregious and troubling examples of EPA overreach. I want to speak on behalf of the thousands of landowners in my district, in my home state of Utah, that face a new threat due to the heavy hand of the EPA. This will affect farmers, it will affect ranchers, and even homeowners as they come into the crosshairs of an agency that has ever expanded regulatory agenda. These new actions from the EPA are nothing short of a power grab that will have significant impact on infrastructure, on energy, and land development. Back in September, the EPA published a draft rule to more heavily regulate the Clean Water Act. Now, make no mistake, this rule is wholly in defiance of recent Supreme Court rulings that determined the agency was out of step with current law. The draft rule would allow the EPA to regulate virtually every body of water in the United States, including private lakes, small ponds, seasonal streams. Every depression, no matter how far away it was from a jurisdictional water, could fall under this regulation. It would require farmers to get approval from the EPA before they planted their crops. It would require permits from the EPA before you could build on your own property. And it would hand environmentalists another way to sue property owners. It would drastically increase the cost and the time frame of building any piece of infrastructure, whether it's a highway or a power plant, all of the things that communities need in order to survive. Everyone agrees that we should protect the environment. There's a reason that I chose to live in Utah. I love to rock climb. I love to hike. I love to ski. I grew up on a farm. I love the land. I want to protect the land. But the presumption is that because I'm a Republican, I must hate the land, and I think it's absurd. If you want to take a meaningful step towards restoring trust between the American people and the federal government, then rein in the power of the EPA. It appears that our president has exactly the opposite in mind, and that scares me to death. And it frankly should scare every American. I hope that he doesn't. I hope we're able to control this agency. I hope that this discussion tonight helps move us forward towards doing that. And with that, Madam, I yield back.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Excellent points there. I think you're right. We need to make regulations that make sense. And what the EPA is doing does not make sense. And it does feed into the distrust of government bureaucracy by the American people, and well-deserved when they have some of these regulations coming out that they've been proposing that are harming Americans. So that's why we're here tonight, to raise these concerns and to fight against them. And I'm so glad today to get to pass the baton here to my friend from North Carolina, Representative George Holdings. So thank you for sharing your comments.
Well, I want to thank the gentlelady for bringing us here today to talk about this important issue. Mr. Speaker, Excessive and burdensome regulations have become a pattern under this administration, and it's harmful to business and prevents growth in our economy. One area of concern amongst many that I have and my constituents have in North Carolina is the proposed Environmental Protection Agency rule, which would make changes to the Clean Water Act. The proposed rule by EPA would grant them control over essentially all waters, not just navigable waters, as any common sense person understands navigable waters, and which is clearly defined in the Clean Water Act of 1972 and has been upheld by the Supreme Court. But in North Carolina, farmers who are a critical part of this economy and community, earlier this week I had the chance to meet with a group of farmers from Wayne County, which is a large population center in my district. And one of their greatest concerns was not a traditional farmer concern that you hear. It wasn't a concern about feed prices or soil fertility or farm equipment maintenance. It had to do with a federal agency attempting to regulate any ditch, puddle, or dry creek bed within their property lines. And this proposed rule from EPA would take away control from these farmers and place it in the hands of a federal government bureaucracy. Now, the EPA claims that it needs the authority to do this, but in reality, this expansion of power would unnecessarily put local and state issues in the federal government's hands. The EPA wants to expand the jurisdiction to intrastate waters, which could include isolated streams or ditches. This is extremely consequential to private property owners who could now be subject to EPA regulations even if they merely have a small pond in their backyard. Mr. Speaker, if the EPA is given this authority, private property owners will be vulnerable to lawsuits from environmental groups for not complying with the regulations. And in some of these cases, these waters have nothing to do with federal interests, and the rule could override state prerogatives. The rule would allow the EPA to regulate activities beyond the scope of interstate commerce, which is clearly not what was intended by the Clean Water Act when it was passed in 1972. It's essential that we support policies that help farmers, not only in North Carolina, not only in my district, but across the country, to grow and produce their crops. They cannot afford to be laid low by overreaching government regulations. These are not large corporations. We're talking about local farmers who are farming sweet potatoes or soybeans or tobacco. And for them, these new regulations can be complex, and compliance can be time-consuming and expensive. Mr. Speaker, the Small Business Office of Advocacy has reported that federal rulemaking has imposed a cumulative burden of $1.75 trillion on our economy. We should not add more to the problem with the proposed EPA rule, but rather we should be doing all we can to alleviate the burden on our farmers, small businesses, and our nation's economy. Again, I want to thank the gentlelady from Missouri for organizing this hearing this afternoon, and thank her for her time. I yield back.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. And I wanted to follow up on just your exact same story. I hear the same from my farmers in Missouri. And this picture here on this poster, I hope everyone can see, because I want to show you what Representative Holding was just talking about. The Clean Water Act gave the EPA authority to regulate navigable waters, and that's the pictures here. There would be something you would consider navigable water, and they work with the Army Corps of Engineers to develop regulations for that. The picture on the right is what I consider non-navigable, and I think most people with common sense would. They're farm ponds, they're puddles, they're ditches. And this is what EPA is trying to expand its reach to regulating. And as Representative Holding said, it was so true, this is going to impact every farmer, every property owner, and it is a violation of property rights. The government should not have any control or say over how people manage their ponds. Or if there's a puddle in the field, they shouldn't have to ask permission to be able to plant a crop there. And yet that's what you have, one of the things that EPA is doing. So thank you for bringing that up, and I wanted everybody to just see an opportunity of how ridiculous this really is and what an overreach of government is. So thank you very much, Joe, for showing that picture. Now I'd like to turn to my friend Andy Barr from Kentucky, and he knows a little bit about coal, I know, and a lot of the other impacts of EPA. So please share with us your thoughts on this topic.
Well, I thank the gentlelady and appreciate her leadership and for organizing this special order and her leadership in highlighting a real problem in our country right now. You know, the President of the United States the other night in the State of the Union made an observation. And the President's observation was one where he described an economy in which inequality has deepened and upward mobility has stalled. And unfortunately, in many respects, the President is right. But he's wrong about what has caused that problem to exist in our economy. The truth is, a major reason why upward mobility has stalled is because the Environmental Protection Agency, under his direction, has produced a deluge of red tape and regulations that are literally strangling the nation's economy. The poor are worse off today than they were when President Obama took office. 7 million more Americans live in poverty today as compared to 2008. Median household income has fallen over $2,000 in the last 4 years. 76% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. And the percentage of working age people actually in the workforce has dropped to the lowest rate in 35 years in the Obama economy. The EPA is majorly responsible for this. The coal industry of my region in central and eastern Kentucky could be the poster child of this regulatory onslaught. According to the Commonwealth's recently released figures, more than 7,000 coal miners in the Appalachian coalfields have received pink slips since 2009. 2,232 of those jobs were lost last year alone, thanks in large part to the overreach of the EPA. The percentage of coal miners in our state is the lowest number of coal miners since 1927 in the coal labor market, and that's since they actually started keeping those statistics. So whether it's deadlocking the permit process or trying to effectively ban coal-fired electricity through disastrous greenhouse gas regulations, EPA's army of unelected bureaucrats have been very direct about their efforts to reshape the entire sectors of our economy. In fact, the President's own climate advisor was reported as saying a war on coal is exactly what we need. So what bothers me about this is that there is a total disregard for the human cost to hardworking Americans, their families, who have lost these paychecks, who have been laid off with no other economic opportunity. There is a problem with upward mobility in this country. There is income inequality. But it's because of this administration's policies that are devastating these coal mining families. And make no mistake, these costs are generally borne by the nation's most vulnerable, who can least afford higher energy prices. A recent study analyzing government data found that for the 180,000 families in Kentucky making less than $10,000 per year, energy costs consume more than 2/3 of after-tax income. That means for every $100 they take home, about $70 goes to covering the cost of energy. The EPA's ruinous policies will only drive those rates higher, adding to the burdens on those already struggling to make ends meet. Folks like our seniors on fixed incomes, they can't afford these higher utility bills. The President likes to talk about the war on poverty. My friends on the other side of the aisle like to talk about the war on poverty. Well, it's hard to win the war on poverty when you are waging a relentless war on jobs. And that's exactly what's happening with the EPA. EPA officials think that they know what's best for you, for your family, and for your community, whether you live in Kentucky or Texas or California. But when Congress has asked for some evidence to justify this one-size-fits-all approach, they failed to provide it. And when I'm sure that it was much easier for these bureaucrats to have listening sessions on greenhouse gas regulations in Washington, D.C., or San Francisco, California. The 3 states that produce the most coal, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Wyoming, they were not on the list where the EPA went to visit. I don't think the bureaucrats would have received such a warm welcome from the coal miners of my state, whose jobs were lost, the small businesses that no longer have customers, many in my home district, the teachers whose schools have lost a major source of tax revenue. They no longer have those funds because of the war on coal and the loss of revenue. But as I've warned for some time, the impact of EPA regulations will not be limited to the coal fields of Appalachia. If the EPA has its way, rising electricity rates, like we've already seen this winter, will ripple through this economy, threatening the manufacturer renaissance. Home heating bills will spike. Goods and services will cost more, depressing consumer demand. Businesses will have to devote money that could have gone to investment and hiring to cover higher energy costs at a time when they can least afford it. Companies considering to locate here in the United States will leave because our energy advantage will instead go overseas, where labor and energy are cheaper and regulatory environment is less suffocating. Americans are calling for more jobs, but the federal bureaucracy is trying to make sure those jobs go elsewhere. And all of this is happening through agency rulemaking, because that's the only way that the president's environmentalist wish list can come into being. Similar policies have repeatedly failed in the face of bipartisan opposition in Congress. The president and the EPA, deaf to the vehement refusals of the American people and their elected officials to go along with this extremist agenda, are resorting to the only means that they have left: legally questionable rulemaking and executive actions unilaterally administered by the executive branch. The House has made its position loud and clear. These policies are at odds with the intent of Congress and not in the best interest of the American people. In fact, they are actually bankrupting many hardworking Americans. Enough is enough, Mr. Speaker. I would encourage the President and the EPA to approach Congress with an open, transparent program that balances environmental protection with economic growth. It can be done if Congress has a willing negotiator in the White House. But continuing to impose these rules by executive proclamation unilaterally fails to benefit the environment, and it serves only to harm our constituents and our democracy. If this President, if this Congress is serious about dealing with poverty, if we are serious about dealing with income inequality, if we are really genuinely interested in helping the poor in this country, let's not attack hardworking Americans. Let's focus on job creation and growth, and let's unleash the energy potential of the United States. So I thank the gentlelady for her leadership, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Wow. Thank you very, very much. I don't think anyone could say it any better than that. I appreciate as well your comments about coal, because in my district I have the only still working coal mine in Missouri. And in Missouri, 85% of our energy comes from coal, and it is an extremist agenda that would raise the price of energy unnecessarily, especially on the hardest hit Americans whose jobs hours are being cut back because of other policies from this country coming forth, and whose paychecks are shrinking. Why would you artificially raise the cost of their electric bills due to regulations that aren't even scientifically based, and shut off a major source of energy in this country that's affordable, reliable, safe, and clean, and that's coal? So thank you for sharing that very much. Now I'd like to go to my friend from Oklahoma, James Langford, to hear his thoughts about EPA and how it's hurting Americans and how we can provide better solutions.
There's a lot of things that we've done as a nation that really have greatly benefited the health and economy of our nation. We've engaged, and there are some that would say to Republicans, the Republicans just want dirty air and dirty water, and they just assume we want unhealthy kids and all those things. I've had people that have complained to me here while I've been in the House of Representatives and saying, don't you care about kids with asthma? And I look at them and say, yeah, my daughter's one of them. So don't throw back in my face we don't care about our own kids and we don't care about the environment. My youngest daughter, a couple of years ago, we were sitting at an intersection. The car in front of us took off, and black smoke came out of the back of it. And she said out loud, "Is that car on fire?" And as a kid who grew up in the 1970s like I did, I thought, no, that's what every car did in the 1970s. But we made real changes. And it has affected our environment. But it's fascinating to me now that the EPA and the rules that were put in place to protect all Americans have moved from where they were in the 1970s to now trying to get to the most granular, small level that's pushing beyond health and safety down to a level that is actually controlling business and the basic operation of our economy. This is no longer about health and safety of people anymore. Those rules have long been changed and been in place. This is something different. Basic rules. There's a rule that probably no one tracks. It's a 316B rule. No one's heard of the 316B rule, but what it does with power plants. Most power plants, as people drive past all the time and see them, have a lake around them. And in that lake, there's typically fish. And quite frankly, for many power plants that are there in many parts of the country, the power company actually built that lake and then stocked it. And those are some in Oklahoma. Some of the best fishing lakes in Oklahoma are right around power plants because the water's a little bit warmer and the fish multiply. Well, the water that comes in through one side of that lake actually goes underneath the power plant to actually cool the power plant. It's not the steam that comes out of the top. It's just like a big radiator that comes in. And there's a grating screen that keeps all the fish out and everything else because they don't want that going underneath the plant as well, hurt the tubing and such. Occasionally, a fish gets what's called impinged on that screen. They're typically minnows, what we use in Oklahoma for fishing bait. So the EPA is stepping in to power companies and making massive changes in their requirements to the screens around the outside of that to keep fish, minnows, bait fish, from being caught on that. Well, the offer's been made to say, you know, if 100 bait fish are killed on this screen during this time, can we just buy 100 bait fish and put it in? We can go down to the local, bait shop and get 100 fish and just restock it. And they say no. It requires millions of dollars of change to go around that screen to prevent that. Who pays for that? Ratepayers pay for that. The President made a statement in his State of the Union address when he said, "These things will be hard, but they're right for the environment." You know who it's hard on? The poorest in our society. Elderly people that are on fixed income. That electricity bill matters to them. And you can't just flippantly say, Mr. President, this is going to be hard, but we've got to do it, when the people that's going to be hardest on and it's going to be affected the most are the people that this government should protect, rather than just look at them and say, this is going to be hard, but you're going to pay a higher bill. Simple things like regional haze. Rules were made years ago on regional haze. Regional haze is a rule dealing with aesthetics, what the air looks like, not air quality, not what we breathe, not health, just aesthetics. So the rule was made, if this is just about aesthetics, not about health, the state should make those rules. Then in what's called a sue and settle agreement, this administration allowed a lawsuit, broke off separately from the normal judicial process, made an arrangement with these environmental groups, and then came back to states and said a judge is imposing that. A judge is not imposing that. They made a deal with environmentalist groups around the people that it would affect and now imposing it on states. What's the root result of that? Higher prices for electricity. Not because of health, but because of aesthetics. And again, the President's statement, this is going to be hard. We're aware. It's going to be hard on the people that should be protected by this nation, not just someone step into their house and saying, sorry, your electricity bill's higher, this is going to be hard. That doesn't help anyone. Families know that day-to-day life is hard. They don't need this government making it harder for them. We need to stand up and protect them. It's important that we have clean air and clean water. It's also important that we protect our families and not bring them undue expense that matters nothing for basic human health and population in that. I thank the gentlelady for hosting this time and for this conversation, because these EPA issues are not just Washington issues. They're issues that matter to our families. They're issues that do change the price of our electricity and our energy. And when people say all the time, why doesn't my check go as far as it used to go? Why does life seem to cost so much now? I say to them, Welcome to the regulation world that we live in, where someone from D.C. says this is going to be hard and you pay more. With that, I yield back.
We've turned, sadly, into a regulation nation, and it's wrong. But some of us, and the ones here tonight speaking, are not going to sit by and allow this and stand idly by. We're fighting against it, and that's why we're here. And I totally agree with my colleague that it's wrong to just tell people, well, this is going to be hard, but you're going to have to pay more on your electric bill, basically because of this new regulation, because we care more for a minnow than we do about people. That's wrong. It's time to change things. And I appreciate my friend from Ohio, Representative Robert Latta, and being here tonight, and welcome your comments on this issue.
Well, thanks very much, and I appreciate the General Lady for organizing this special order tonight. And the issue about the EPA and what it's doing back home and across our nation is an issue that we all have to really pay attention to. I serve on the Energy and Commerce Committee, and we look at this all the time in our subcommittee. And we have hearings continually, and, you know, people back home always ask, what's going on? Why is this happening? As the gentleman from Oklahoma just said. And my district's unique. I have 60,000 manufacturing jobs, and I also represent the largest number of farmers in the state of Ohio. And when I'm home, I spend most of my time, and over the last 16-plus months, I've probably done about 450 different meetings in my district, visiting manufacturing plants, farmers, small businesses. And I always ask them, what's the issue that you're most concerned about? And the number one issue I hear from them all the time the number one issue is on regulations. Regulations are the number one thing that are holding back Americans from creating more jobs in this country. And so, you know, it's very important that I ask them, well, who is it? What regulations? It's the EPA. It's the number one agency I hear about from my constituents all the time. And earlier this session, I offered H.R. 724. And 724 is a piece of legislation that received bipartisan support here in the House. And not only did it receive bipartisan support, it passed unanimously. And what that bill does, it gets rid of a piece of regulation that's no longer necessary under the Clean Air Act. It's a piece of, there's a regulation on the books out there that requires from small to large to medium auto dealers in this country that they would have to go out and give the buyer a piece of paper telling them that, yes, it met all the requirements. Well, it's no longer a piece of paper that needs to be given. It's something that should have been gotten rid of a long time ago, because it's online, it's on the cars, it says right there that that car meets all the emission standards. So what we need to do is just start paring back these types of regulations. And that bill has gone over to the Senate, and I hope our friends over there in the very near future take that up, because, again, it's something that helps the communities. Because, again, you know, when you talk about folks back home, you know, the folks back home, and, you know, it's like the auto dealers. They're the ones that sponsor Little League teams. They're the ones that are out there making sure that they're donating. So let's give them more time to do things like helping their communities, and, by the way, selling more cars, putting more people to work. So that's very, very important. And we also, you know, as the speaker from Oklahoma had also mentioned, that, you know, there's nobody out there that doesn't say that we don't want clean air and clean water. We all want that. But in recent years, the EPA has put forward broad-reaching regulatory proposals that are either unachievable or lack sufficient cost-benefit justifications. And one of the most harmful proposals includes the greenhouse gas emission standards for new power plants that aim to stop the use of coal as an energy source. And we've all heard from folks tonight talking about how much coal is being used in their not only in their districts but their states. But in the state of Ohio, we get about 78% of our electricity comes from coal-fired plants. Now, if you know, when you talk about what's going to happen if all these regulations go on, who's that going to affect? Well, it's going to affect the very vulnerable citizens in our districts. You know, those senior citizens out there on fixed incomes. That's going to increase the cost for them. They're going to have to make the choice, you know, about heating their homes or refilling those life-saving prescriptions that they might have to have. So when we look at the EPA and it fails to consider what those real-life impacts are on all these proposals that it's proposing out there, or the small business owner who struggles to make the payroll, or the newly hired employee facing the reduced hours, or, again, that senior citizens on fixed income trying to budget in these tough times, those are the things that have to be considered. One of the things I think was really staggering was in 2011, the SBA came out, the Small Business Administration came out with a report that we have $1.7 trillion of regulations in this country today. $1.7 trillion. Well, unfortunately, that got up to $1.8 trillion. And that's what we're dealing with in this country. And people wonder why jobs aren't being created in this country. Well, we just have to look at Washington. What are we doing to them here? So what we need to do, in my opinion, is invite the EPA to visit our districts. And I've actually had some folks in my district said that they'd be glad to have them come in to show the EPA in one company that they had all these different manuals and books and everything on the table, and they showed me, and they said one thing. They would love to have them come in because it doesn't even apply to their plant. And that's what's going on. So they're trying to take a round peg and drive it through a square hole. So we got to do that to help our hard-working American taxpayers out, meet these goals, to create more jobs, to help their families, and help the future. And with that, I thank the General Lady again for hosting this tonight. And, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
You bet. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you for your leadership on that. It was a great bill, and we really need more of that to push back on these onerous regulations by the EPA. Like you point out, that cost overall the taxpayers $1.8 trillion a year just to comply with paperwork. That's wrong. Now I'd like to turn to my friend from Florida, Representative Yoho, Ted Yoho, to share his thoughts.
I'd like to thank the gentlelady from the great state of Missouri, Ms. Hartzler, for the privilege of being able to address one of the greatest issues facing our nation today, the unilateral imposition of regulations coming out of an administrative agency known as the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, that's strangulating effects those regulations have on business development and our economy. My home state, the great state of Florida, is fortunate enough to play host to a myriad of beautiful animals, landscapes, waterways, and beaches. And I believe that we all play a role in being good stewards of our natural resources. We all want clean water. We all want clean air. And as Mr. Langford was talking about his daughter or his child having asthma, I have asthma. And so I know the importance of this. And so, yes, we do want a clean environment. Many rural districts like mine often have unique needs, whether it's the farmer farming to put food on his table, or to keep his family fed, or to feed a nation. They need to keep the lights on, they need to keep the storefronts on, or bringing jobs back to our district through projects like the dredging of the St. John's Waterway, which is a crucial infrastructure project in our district that would create thousands of jobs, and yet we have to deal with EPA regulations. Congress must ensure efficient and effective policies are being implemented that both boost the economy and uphold environmentally friendly industry standards. However, the EPA has overstepped its authority time and time again by imposing unwarranted, costly federal regulations on states and on individuals. Last year, the EPA issued 1,624 rules and notices. In this year alone, the EPA has issued 148 new rules and notices. To sum this up, since the beginning of the 113th Congress alone, and I repeat, since the beginning of just the 113th Congress, the EPA has issued 1,759 new rules and notices. In a little over 12 months, the EPA has issued on an average just under 147 new rules and notices per month. That's just under 34 a week, just under 11 a day. 11 new regulations a day. This is an incredible rate, and every industry is affected, and they're finding it harder and harder to keep up. Take, for example, the highly debated cap-and-trade emission standards the EPA and the current administration are pushing, and this is going to affect every American. The EPA website says, and I quote, "Cap and trade is an environmental policy tool that delivers results with a mandatory cap on emissions while providing sources flexibility in how they comply. Successful cap and trade programs reward innovation, efficiency, and early action and provide strict environmental accountability without inhibiting growth." This is simply not true. It strangles businesses, it costs money, and it stifles economic growth. Overzealous regulations by the EPA, which is, again, an administrative agency, things like cap and trade, they handcuff our economy and make America less competitive in the world, because emerging markets like China and India will never adopt such destructive taxes, yet they put our manufacturers in a hold and make America less competitive. Further restricting the opportunities in this country, and they lower the job growth in this country. Now I have just a few stories I'd like to share with you. One of them is about a constituent of mine, and we've talked about this, and you held up the navigable waterways. It's a dairy farmer. The EPA he's been in battle with for over a couple years. It's cost him over $400,000, $200,000 in fines, and it's for a depression on his property. That's been there for years. It's a depression that when it rains, it fills up and it evaporates. But yet, he's fought the EPA on this for over 2 years at the cost of $200,000 in fines, $200,000 to fix it, and in lawyer fees. This can't go on. It drives people out of business. Then we have, in our area, I visited a power plant. And that power plant was tasked with meeting a new EPA goal standard for their emissions, and it cost them over $500 million. And they had 4 years to complete it. They got halfway through the project, and the EPA came out and says, never mind, we changed the rule. They've already spent the money, half the money, yet the EPA says you don't have to comply. And we see this over and over again. And according to the new EPA studies, by their own admissions, they said that the new rules on the carbon capture standards would have an insignificant effect on human health and our environment. Yet it's going to cripple every American in this country and cost them a lot more in money. Our role in government is to legislate. Legislate to make America safer and economically stronger, not to govern by an administrative agency with little oversight that winds up stifling business development and our economic growth. It's high time Congress reminds the EPA of what its original purpose was, and that's to protect human health and the environment by writing and enforcing regulations based on the laws that we pass, not regulations that stifle America. And I'd like to thank the lady from Missouri for the opportunity and for organizing this. You did a great job and a great service to the American people. Thank you.
Well, your comments were very, very helpful to what we're doing tonight, making people aware of how these EPA regulations hurt real people. And I think your example of the 2-year fine of two-year fight and $200,000 fine just for a low area in your yard that fills with water. I mean, this is just too much.
By the time he was done, and he just threw up his hands. And this is happening all over America.
Absolutely.
So I thank you again.
You bet. Well, thank you, and that's why we're here fighting tonight. I'd like to turn over now to my friend from Arkansas, just a little south of me, Representative Rick Crawford.
Thank you. I thank the gentlelady and her staff for arranging the special order to discuss this issue that we've been talking about, the egregious overreach of the Environmental Protection Agency. I want to talk about an issue that's very close to you, near and dear to you, and that you've helped me on, and that is the spill prevention and containment countermeasures issue facing farmers across the country. We've taken action on this, and if you are like me and your staff is like my staff, we fielded countless phone calls from farmers concerned about these new rules that the EPA was attempting to roll out with respect to on-farm fuel storage at really an unmanageable level. 1,320 gallons was the threshold that would require that the farmers construct these spill prevention and containment countermeasures. And for those who don't know what those are berms or protective dikes around a storage facility that can cost tens of thousands of dollars to ag producers. And, farmers are not, they may be land rich, capital rich, but they're not cash rich by any stretch of the imagination. And so this adds cost to their operation. And really, who pays for that? We've talked about it with our power plants. The ratepayers pay. The American people pay for that because prices go up. And that generally, while the farmer bears the burden initially, ultimately those costs are passed on to the consumer, which is the case in nearly every one of these issues where we see the EPA engaging in overreach. And so we took to the floor to try to change this, and we were successful not once but twice in passing by voice vote the Fuels Act. And that would have changed the threshold from 1,320 gallons to 10,000 gallons. And between 10,000 and 42,000, you would be required to build the structure, but above 42,000 would then be required to engage the services of a professional engineer for certification to meet that standard for the EPA's compliance. Now, the University of Arkansas did a study on the Fuels Act addressing the spill prevention containment countermeasures, and they estimated nationwide that this bill, which was passed successfully on the House floor, would save American farmers $3.3 billion. So now, I don't know about you, but I think that's $3.3 billion that could do our economy a heck of a lot better service than chasing this problem that really doesn't exist. And so why do I say this problem doesn't exist? Well, a decade ago, the USDA did an analysis of the spill prevention and containment countermeasures, and they discovered there was little, if any, evidence of farms having any oil spills. In fact, 99% of farmers had never experienced an oil spill, and that means that the compliance cost at $3.3 billion is essentially a problem, a solution in search of a problem. It really doesn't exist. But what we did was we took that 10,000 gallon threshold directly from the underlying bill, or the underlying law, the Clean Water Act, that regulates on-farm fuel storage, and they define in their own words 10,000 gallons being a proper definition of a family farm, small farm fuel storage. Economies of scale are certainly storing more than 10,000 gallons on their farm. As you know, being a farmer yourself, you know that you store in greater quantity than 10,000 gallons, particularly if you're engaged in a larger scale operation. So the evidence just isn't there to support the 1,320 gallon threshold, number one. Number two, we had over 30 commodity organizations and agricultural organizations that were in support of the bill. We passed it twice on the floor. The Senate will not move. The EPA continues to move forward, and we continue to be concerned about the EPA's drive to overregulate on-farm fuel storage. So, again, I want to thank the gentlelady for her leadership on this and bringing this to the attention of the American people, because everything that we've heard tonight and everything that's been talked about has a direct impact on their bottom line and the quality of life for their farmers. And I'll echo what my colleagues have said. We certainly don't want to see a poor air quality or poor water quality. I have kids at home. I love my kids. You love your kids. I know you have small ones at home too. We're just as committed to a clean environment as anybody is. But we're also committed to the quality of life and the costs incurred in that quality of life and a more responsible approach. And so, again, I thank the gentlelady and yield back.
Well, thank you for your leadership on this. That issue is just so important to farmers all across this country and rural communities who could certainly use that $3.3 billion.
Absolutely.
Now I'd like to turn to my friend from Oklahoma, Mark Wayne Mullins, to share his thoughts on the EPA.
I'd like to thank the gentlelady from Missouri. You know, this is something that's very near and dear to my heart. The only reason I stand in front of you is because I realized one day that the biggest threat that I had to my family business was the federal government from the over-regulateness. And I woke up one day and realized I was literally spending 40 cents on every dollar that came in our company to simply comply with different mandates and regulations that came down from this area. I never dreamed I would ever stand up here one day as a congressman. There was never a thought. I never even owned a suit until after I won the election. But my family, we're strongly rooted in entrepreneurs, from farming to plumbing all the way to banking. And we understand regulation well. But the biggest threat we have to this economy is overreaching regulations. And let me share just a real quick story. My uncle Darrell Mullen from Clear Fork, Oklahoma, big metropolitan area. I'm sure everybody around here has heard of that. Same place he was born and raised. Same place my dad and his brothers and sisters were born and raised. He's been raising chickens right there since 1971. 42 years he's raised chickens, and he raised a family raising chickens and farming. And the EPA came in and started fining people on little silly stuff. including feathers, fining poultry growers, chicken farmers on feathers. Now, you're going to tell me that a place where my Uncle Darrell grew up his entire life, he doesn't have pride on the land that he lives on? You're telling me people that have never stepped foot in Oklahoma and probably never even stepped foot in a farm, but they're up here in D.C., they know how to manage our land better than we know how to manage our land? I find it a joke. It's embarrassing. And they should be embarrassed, because they're going to kill the entrepreneur spirit. And they're going to run small farmers out of business. In 2013 was the last batch of chickens my Uncle Darrell got. Wasn't because of his health, wasn't because he didn't want to still manage it, but he just got to the point where it wasn't profitable for him to be able to do it anymore. He was spending all his time rather doing what he loves, trying to comply with mandates that the EPA is putting down on small farmers all over the country. And what we're seeing is these small farmers have raised families, and they were raised on the same farm. Generations of farmers are starting to have to sell out. And large corporations that have more people to balance the pay, to balance the cost around, are having to come in and take the spot of these small farmers that started the same way my uncle did. Now you tell me, what good are they doing? Are they helping America? No, they're killing the entrepreneur spirit of America. They're costing us jobs. They're taking our way of life. They're ruining families. You know, this country was built on the back of farmers. The work ethic that we have as Americans came from the farming community. We get up every day, we pull our boots on, we go to work, and we take pride because we accomplished something that no one else can accomplish, and we did it that day. We come over challenges every day, more and more challenges we overcome, and it's something we take pride in. You can't tell us we can't do a job. We're the only one that can tell us we can't. But one challenge we haven't been able to come over, and that's right here in Washington, D.C. That's bureaucrats that get up every day and try to tell us how to live our lives. And yet we survived all these years without them. And the EPA, as I stand in front of the gentlelady from Missouri today, the EPA, they're the biggest threat we have to this country right now. They're the biggest threat we have to our way of life right now. And they're doing nothing but costing us jobs by trying to say they're saving us from ourselves. It's embarrassing, but I'm sure glad I'm up here, standing in front of you today to fight for our way of life. I'd like to thank the gentlelady from Missouri for giving me this time, giving me the opportunity to stand in front of you, and thank you for exposing the EPA for what they are instead of what they hide behind. I yield back.
I'm glad you're here tonight. I'm glad you're here representing the common person in this country who is fighting these regulations every day, who's had real-world experience dealing with the EPA like many of us have. And you're exactly right. It is stifling jobs and hurting people. And whether it's the families back in Missouri who are dealing with the big 10-inch snow that we got yesterday, and they're wanting to heat their home with a wood-burning stove or turn up the thermostat and worry about their electricity bills at the end of the month, or whether it's the farmer out there who's trying to raise chickens and provide poultry and meat for this country, and then they have the government trying to regulate their feathers. Last year, the EPA tried to regulate farm dust. Now they're trying to expand the definition of navigable waters to regulating farm ponds and ditches and little depressions in the fields, and asking for permission from Americans to be able to farm their land. There's other regulations we haven't even talked about tonight dealing with permitting and being able to spray crop protection products on their crops. Farmers get this every day, but so do manufacturers, so do businesses, and so does anyone who has to pay an electric bill every month with the President's war on coal. So that's why here in the House we are standing strong against the EPA. We're exposing what they're doing and how it's hurting Americans, and why it's important for the Senate to move on our bills, to rein in the EPA, to bring common sense back to Washington, and to return this government of the people, by the people, to start working for the people once again. And with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
I make the motion to adjourn, Mr. Speaker.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those in favor and opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 9:00 a.m. tomorrow.